Welcome to today's webinar, Big Progress in Reducing Retail Food Waste, New Data from the Pacific Coast Food Waste Commitment. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Dana Gunders, and I'm the Executive Director here at ReFed. For those of you not familiar with ReFed, we are a US-based nonprofit working to catalyze the food system towards evidence-based action to stop wasting food. We serve as a resource partner for the Pacific Coast Food Waste Commitment, and so we are hosting this webinar today really on behalf of the Pacific Coast Food Waste Commitment. The goal of our work at ReFed is to increase the adoption of food waste solutions, and one way that we can do that is through webinars like this, where we share data, we share insights, and we try to help inform the work that all of you out there are doing. We have some exciting webinars planned for 2024, so be on the lookout for announcements about them. And we also have the 2024 ReFed Food Waste Solutions Summit coming up in less than 2 months. We cannot wait to welcome you all in Baltimore. It'll be June 11th through June 13th. 3 days of insights, inspiration, action. It's always really an amazing time. We just released the schedule for the summit. And so check that out. We have a mix of programming, main stage, keynotes, breakout panels, happy hours, networking sessions, field trips. The field trips are always really fun. And other just fun trivia challenges, film screenings. We have no-host dinners and more. So check it out. This year, we're also excited to host a series of competitive showcases at the summit that will be highlighting some of the amazing work that solution providers are doing. And yeah, we know that most conferences are back to being in person, so you really have to make a commitment to attend that you didn't have to, when things were just virtual. So we're trying to make it worth it and make it fun and exciting and educational, productive, all the things. So if you haven't gotten your ticket yet, we are putting the summit registration link in the chat for you here, and we will see you all in Baltimore. All right, now, as most of you hopefully heard over the past week, the Pacific Coast Food Waste Commitment, which we will be referring to as the PCFWC, a tricky acronym, we know, but the PCFWC has just released a brand new report that tracks year-over-year retail food waste. And we are so excited this year to see that retailers are moving the needle in a big way. The PCFWC is a public-private partnership for food businesses and jurisdictions along the U.S. West Coast to work together to cut waste. And the new progress report found that grocery retailers made the most significant progress ever reported in the United States on reducing food waste in the retail sector. Over the period from 2019 to 2022, which is the last year that data is available, grocery retailers decreased the number of tons of unsold food in their regional operations by 25%. That's nearly 190,000 tons of food, and it's about $311 million worth. And that represents a decrease in the amount of food that's at risk of going to waste. So that's really like a prevention measure for those of you who are in the nomenclature there. The report also found positive trends for where the unsold food is ending up and its impacts, including a huge decrease in the total carbon footprint that unsold food in the region has. So we'll dig into those specifics in the data in just a minute, but I wanted to set up the discussion just by saying that this is hands down the largest progress in reducing food waste that we have ever seen reported. This is a really big deal. I fell off my chair when I first saw these numbers, because in the almost 15 years I've been working on this topic, I have never seen real results at this scale. So really exciting for me and everyone involved. And importantly, rather than just being based on indicators or estimates, if you're wonky, if you're someone who's in the data, you know how many estimates we are often using, but this study used actual data that was tracked and reported by the retail signatories that are part of the PCFWC. So, we're not there yet. Obviously, there's a lot more work that needs to be done, but this really shows what can happen when businesses make a concerted effort to track their waste and evolve their operations to address it. So thrilled to get into more detail with you all. For today's webinar, I'm joined by my colleague, Jackie Suggitt, who is on ReFed's Capital Innovation and Engagement team. For those of you who have been to the summit before, Jackie is the driving force behind that, and she also oversees ReFed's Business Services, which is a suite of offerings to help provide strategic and educational assistance to food businesses who are launching food waste reduction initiatives. And part of that includes business participation in the PCFWC and also the new U.S. Food Waste Pact, which is a national initiative that builds on the success of the West Coast companies that are part of the PCFWC model. So, hello, Jackie. I also want to let you know before I pass it over that Jackie will be joined a bit later by Nichols-Vinueza. Alex is the program manager for food loss and waste at the World Wildlife Fund, a close partner of ReFed's and also a PCFWC resource partner. He'll be coming on a bit later to talk with Jackie about what all of this means for PCFWC and beyond. But first, I will hand things off to Jackie to walk you through all of the data.
Thank you, Dana. Awesome. I am also very excited for today's webinar and echo Dana's enthusiasm for everything that we're seeing and hearing around this data. I am going to be doing a lot of talking for the next little bit, which I apologize for, but I did want to remind you, please do use the chat and ask your questions as we go along. I know several of our data team are on this call, so they may be able to respond directly as we talk through if there are specific questions on the data. We'll also have some time at the end to address as many of those as we can. So do lean into that chat if you would like to. Before I do get to the data, I wanted to kind of build on Dana's intro and give a little bit more of a brief overview of the PCFWC just to help provide the context for the insights that we're going to be walking through together and where this data is actually coming from. So the US states of California, Oregon, and Washington, along with British Columbia and Canada, along with the cities of Vancouver, Seattle, Portland, San Francisco, Oakland, and Los Angeles, are part of the Pacific Coast Collaborative. That is a group that is working to reduce carbon emissions within the region through a range of initiatives, including food waste reduction. So the PCFWC is the food waste-centric program of that partnership. And as Dana said a moment ago, it's a public-private partnership between those jurisdictions, as well as King County in Seattle and Alameda County in California, and food businesses from across the supply chain to reduce food waste in the region by 50% by 2030. So really taking that global goal we have and cascading down to a regional level. ReFed serves as a resource partner for that effort, along with WWF, Alex and his team, and WRAP, and the project is overseen by Cascadia Policy Solutions. The PCFWC itself follows the global framework of Target Measure Act, and you can see our current list of signatories up on the slide now. We host a range of working groups and sector-specific convenings for our signatories where they can be sharing best practices and insights with their peers. They also participate in a variety of intervention projects, which we call pilot projects, focused on food waste solutions in their operations, the results of which are turned into case studies and shared publicly throughout the partnership and beyond. An essential focus, obviously, of the PCFWC is data collection. So we have now collected 4 years of retail data on unsold food rates and unsold food destinations for more than 50% of the regional grocery market share on the Pacific Coast, which is the data that we'll be looking at today. Beyond the actual insights that we'll walk through, the PCFWC's data collection efforts are in and of themselves really a significant contribution to the overall body of knowledge, in that they are the most recent and the longest year-over-year aggregated data set we have in the country. And I want to pause and take a minute and recognize the signatories on this slide, and especially the retail signatories who've been behind this work that we're presenting today. I may be the voice of the findings in the webinar, but they are the ones that not only did all the work to collect the data, which is a lot of work, they are also the ones developing and implementing all the strategies that are leading to reductions that we get to celebrate. So I've seen several introduce themselves in the chat, and I see others that have joined. So as a witness to the hours and energy that they've committed within and beyond the PCFWC, I want to give them a virtual round of applause, which y'all are coming through for me with the emoji hands there. So thank you. With that, let's go ahead and dive into the data. I am going to be walking us through 3 primary buckets of data today. The first is the amount of unsold food that we're seeing Second is where that food is going, the unsold food destinations. And then third will be the impacts of that unsold food. And I'll pull out some of the most exciting findings along the way, but definitely guide you to the report itself if you want to dive in further or refresh your memory of any of the things that we're covering today. So first, let's talk about the amount of unsold food. You may notice that I am talking a lot about unsold food, not food waste. So in a retail setting, unsold food tells us of all the food handled, how much didn't go through traditional sales channels. That includes both edible food and inedible food. It also includes food that gets donated or recycled. So unsold food as a rate is a really important measure for tracking food surplus because, as Dana kind of alluded to, it gives us a sense of actual food waste reduction practices, and it's a prevention metric rather than things being impacted by market fluctuations or changes in business performance over time. So in 2022, which is the most recent year of data that we're talking about today, the average unsold food rate in regional grocery stores was 3.2%, which represents a 28% decrease in the unsold food rate since we started measuring in 2019. In more absolute terms, looking at the regional tons of unsold food in the Pacific Coast in 2022, that was around 573,000, which is a 25% reduction since 2019. So a 28% reduction in the rate, 25% reduction in absolute tons. As mentioned earlier, absolute measures of waste, in this case tons, can be influenced by things like population growth, demand for food, food prices, business performance, et cetera. So if the amount of food handled by a grocery store decreases, then the absolute tons of unsold food can decrease even if the rate goes up. I know this is a little wonky. You can see this in the charts here from the years 2020 to 2021, where total tons of unsold food still decreased even though the rate went up. If we were to look, we aren't showing this here, but if we were to look at sales data from these years, you would show that the total food handled by regional grocery stores declined throughout the country. So even though the unsold food rate went up, there was less food in the system to be wasted. And I think we saw a lot of that ourselves as consumers going into retail stores those years. And that's why the absolute tons went down. However, in 2022, the total food handled continued to decrease. So that compounded with the lower unsold food rates, we now see an all-time low in absolute tons of unsold food. Let's dive a little deeper into this. And I just have to comment, I see the questions in the chat. We will get to COVID in our Q&A later. So hold that thought, a really good question. But let's break down this data by department first. So looking at this data more granularly than just all food is really important, because we know that the rate, the volume, the dollar value, and the impact across departments actually varies significantly between produce and meat, for example. So it's the department level data that really helps us identify the hotspots of where we can start to dive into the specific causes of waste and match those to the high impact, high ROI solutions. We are very solution centric in the work that we do. We want, action to come from this data, and this is one of the key reasons why. It also becomes very relevant when we fast forward here in a little bit and start talking about impacts metrics. So we'll come back to this. But focusing first on the unsold food rate, or the percent of all food within each department that goes unsold. Prepared foods, bread and bakery, produce, and fresh meat and seafood departments have the highest unsold food rates in 2022 and have had the highest since we started measuring. When we also consider the retail value, in addition to the unsold food rate, these departments stand out even further, totaling over 75% of the total retail value of all unsold food. This highlights a really significant opportunity for reducing waste in a way that also recoups lost profit through solutions like demand forecasting or inventory control. When we look at tons unsold, or the volume of all food in each department going unsold, the produce department, not surprisingly, continues to contribute the most unsold food by weight with 37.2% of the total share. Despite having a low average price per pound, as produce always does, the volume of produce unsold still makes it a leading department in the retail value unsold. So all of that to say, if the combination of these charts, I think, tells us anything, it's that the unsold food rate really needs to be analyzed in conjunction with the tons of unsold food and the value of that unsold food. If a department is low volume by weight or dollars, then a high unsold food rate alone may not actually be enough to translate to a hotspot worth prioritizing immediately. On the opposite end of the spectrum, a department with a low unsold food rate may justify intervention if that rate applies across a really large volume of food or a really high dollar value amount of food. So these insights and these combination of insights is really what we're looking at in the PCFWC when we start to prioritize projects. And Alex and I will get to talk about that a little bit later on. When modeling solutions to food waste, beyond identifying the amount of waste, we also need to look at where that food is going. So this is my second bucket of data that we're going to look at today, the destinations. Last year, this may look familiar to you. Last year, the EPA launched the Wasted Food Scale. This is an update from the food waste hierarchy that many people on the call may be familiar with before that. And it outlines the preferred destinations where unsold food is going. So in short, if food can't be prevented from becoming surplus in the first place, then actions that keep that food in the human supply chain are preferred, such as donation or recycling into animal feed. And then least preferred are those destinations that the PCFWC defines as waste, so landfill, incineration, and sewer. As we look at our destination data, I want to actually first explain the very far right of this slide, which is the unknown destination, and maybe preemptively answer a few questions here. So we use a two-pronged approach when we measure unsold food. First, we look at total food coming in the door versus total food going out the door. And we use financial metrics as the basis for that. The second way is we add up all the known recorded destinations of where that unsold food is going. The unknown destination rate is basically the difference between those two numbers. So it is telling us how much food surplus we know exists based on financial metrics, but we can't actually account for where it's going in the destination data that we have. So in other words, one purpose it serves is it can stand a little bit as a proxy for the completeness or the robustness of retail waste measurement processes. So as we look at the destination data from our report, with that in mind, I want to call out a couple of things. First, while landfill accounts for the highest volume of the known destination waste, it is followed very closely behind composting, AD, and donations. It is not a strong leader in that regard. These are all very close together. As I mentioned earlier, the overall tons of unsold food in the food system actually decreased from 2019 to 2022. So when considering destinations, it's actually really helpful to look at the donation rates over time, which is what's shown in chart 10 on this slide. Maybe two things I'll pull away from this for now. First is, despite a slight uptick in 2021, the unknown destination rate overall has decreased by 20%. And based on what I said just a few minutes ago about what the unknown destination rate indicates, this is showing potentially improved visibility into where waste is going among food businesses. So it's important to note that the waste originally associated with unknown still has to live somewhere, whether it's being now prevented or not. So it is possible that some of that increase in landfill that we see from 2019 to 2021 is actually related to a decrease in the unknown destination rate. So it's not that more food is going to landfill, but it could be because we actually have better visibility to what's always been going there. The second thing I want to call out, which is one of my favorite takeaways from this report outside of the headline numbers we've already shared, is that we've seen a 20% increase in donation rates and then a 28% increase in composting rates. The donation rate in particular is really exciting to me because even though the overall unsold food is decreasing over time, the available food to donate is decreasing over time. Prioritizing donations is clearly remaining essential priority for our signatories, and that rate is going up. And we've seen evidence of that outside of the data of what's happening through our food recovery working group and other projects that are being led by retail signatories. All right, third and final bucket of data metrics here, and this is the impact of this unsold food. So let's take a look at the environmental and social impacts both of unsold food in retail. Beyond just the tons reduced, these metrics are really important when we start talking about the broader business case and the systemic impact of why we should be focusing on all the issues, why food waste is one that we want to be prioritizing. Just as a little bit of insight for you to get to these numbers, if you're familiar with REFED's impact calculator, we are using the average impact factors that underlie REFED's impact calculator, which you can find on the Insights engine on our website. So as shown here, the total carbon footprint of unsold food for the region decreased by 30% since 2019. The carbon footprint metric, as we outline it here, has two distinct components to it. The upstream contributions from the supply chain activities that are required to get food from production to retail. So agricultural inputs, refrigeration, transportation, packaging, refrigeration again, et cetera. All of those are part of the upstream, as well as the downstream contributions from the destinations of unsold food, which would also include methane that's produced from landfill. The environmental impacts of the upstream component, as many of you probably know, vastly outweigh that of the downstream component. So at least 94% of emissions from retail unsold food in the PCFWC region are incurred before it ever leaves the store. So the decrease in total emissions that we see from 2021 to 2022 is likely related to the department level insights that we talked about earlier. I gave you the preview here. This was going to come back when we started talking about impacts. We saw, if you remember from that, a 36% decrease in fresh meat and seafood, and that is the department with the highest emission factors. So we're seeing the impact of that here. Over the same time period, the only departments that experienced an increase in unsold food were breads and bakery and frozen, which both have a relatively low emission factor and did not outweigh the decrease that we saw across all other departments. I'll also note back to our destination data where we had the unknown bucket there, we categorize unknown as landfill for the sake of calculating these emissions here, which means that the increase in the unknown destination, along with what we do know is going to landfill, was still not enough to counteract the decrease we saw associated with reductions in unsold food overall. So this, to me, is one of the strongest arguments, again, for the role of prevention and prevention solutions to food waste, specifically that the relatively small influence on overall emissions that we see in response to changes downstream versus those changes that are made upstream. That was a lot. Again, I highly recommend going back to the report if you want to spend some more time in this data. But overall, I hope as you walk away from the presentation later today and as you spend more time in that data, that you're energized by the momentum and the progress that this represents. I've shared a little bit of the what. I've shared a little bit of our assumptions on the how and the why. We've seen amazing work by our retail partners over the last few years and are very keen to spend some more time with them this year, diving into better learning and understanding and scaling the strategies that have contributed to these trends. Now, before I bring Alex up here, if you have heard me talk about data before in almost any setting, you've probably heard me say that public reporting is very important for tracking progress and accountability, but it is not the most valuable way we are using this data. So before we do get to Q&A, I want to spend a few minutes discussing other ways that we're using this data beyond just the report that you've seen here, and how and where we're adding value even beyond the geographic boundaries of the West Coast or the four walls of the businesses that are reporting this data. So to do that, I want to welcome Alex to join me on the virtual stage. Hey, Alex, can you hear me?
Yep, can you hear me? Yep.
Yes, awesome, great. Alex, maybe just quickly introduce yourself and your role kind of as a reminder for people here, and then we can talk a little bit about that.
Yep. Hi, everyone. I'm our program manager for food losses and waste here at WWF, and I work closely with my teammates, Ann and Tara, to support a lot of the business engagement that takes place through the PCFWC. And so over the last several years, working closely with the other resource partners to really take this data and help it inform the work that we're doing through different pilot projects that we'll talk about here in a minute.
Awesome. So great to work with Alex and his whole team, and it's such a great partnership that we have here. And as you mentioned, Alex, you work a lot on the signatory engagement side in the working groups through the PCFWC. So maybe I'd love for you to start by sharing what value are you seeing coming out of this data beyond the public report that I just walked through?
Yeah, I think two things. I think that our theory of change has always been that if you get in the motion of regularly reporting, the management of this and the sophistication of how you deal with food waste is going to increase. And I think we've seen that over multiple signatories where just the way that they tackle food waste has gone from maybe a focus just on donation to now having programs around upcycling and using artificial intelligence to prevent food waste. It's really now a very sophisticated rollout to different stores. And so we can get into a couple examples of that. So I think just at a high level, that's been really helpful, as well as just bringing people together so that it's not just target, measure, it's act. It's bringing people into these working groups, right? And saying what's working, what's not, and having that pre-competitive space to share those learnings. So that's at the high level. Just a couple of quick examples for me that really stand out. I'm really impressed with one of our signatories, New Seasons, and what they've been able to do, where they've now got a more sophisticated tracking system in place to know where waste is occurring at the store level, identifying hotspots, In this case, they looked into what were some of those items being thrown away the most, and they identified, for instance, it's rotisserie chickens. And so what can they do with that to keep it in the human supply chain? Well, they're able to repurpose it and serve it through their hot bars or some of their different products they sell versus it, maybe before just going into compost. So that's one example where, again, data to action, and then us being able to work with them, really document that and have them share that out with a wider group. That's a very data specific example. We've also had quite a few folks that have now tested and are using at scale artificial intelligence to take out kind of the human element of inventory management, and just showing how that can really prevent maybe having too much of surplus of certain items. And so we've had a case study on that that's been, I think, really impactful and that we're excited about. But to pair those two more sophisticated data focused examples now with one that I know Dana and Jackie and many of us really love, which is that, not just taking it from a global level data, but also working with people on the ground, using food waste as something to really engage and empower, frontline staff. And so we've worked now with a couple different signatories, one being Bob's Red Mill, where it's about, first and foremost, training those folks on why food waste is important to the company, and then saying, we're going to have a competition. We're going to have incentives for you to go out and identify what are some ways that we can really reduce food waste, even in a very efficiency-focused environment like food manufacturing. And in doing so, we're able to identify some really, it doesn't have to be fancy, sexy, really techie, right? It was things that were really straightforward, like tightening the screw on a certain filter more often instead of just once a day, and having drastic reductions in food waste. So we want the data to be, coming at it from multiple levels. But at the end of the day, I think you and I, Jackie, both get antsy where, great, we put out a case study, or great, we have an idea or data. Now let's actually let's do something about it. And then let's share it out as broadly as we can.
Yeah, that's great examples. And we'll prime for you all a new case study that will be coming out soon that will have even more great examples of some of those. But Alex, I want to highlight maybe one other, which when I was talking about the destinations, I talked about how we use this mix of the value, the volume, the unsold food rates to kind of pick out how we want to focus the efforts of the collaborative. And we just published a case study and one of our favorite projects, I know, even is this whole chain project that we've been talking about. Do you maybe want to just talk about how the data informed that and just what we're seeing coming out of that project?
Yeah, and I would invite the signatories here in a bit to jump in, but I think that they would say, we've heard them say it multiple times, that we did this for strawberries and then for processing potatoes as well on the West Coast. We looked at the retail supply chain, didn't do these in silos, but brought together both the retailers and then the suppliers and growers and said, where across the supply chain are the hotspots for those two commodities? And I think having the data grounded everything and really it really provided an impulse that might not have otherwise been there, right? Before it's like, well, we know that there's upstream loss, but seeing it in their own supply chain, being a part of that project from the start, there has been such an incredible energy. And I would also say a level of ambition that was kind of blew me away as far as now, what are we going to do next? So I will say that those whole chain projects have been great because this is the purpose of what we're doing. This is the vision we had. We didn't want people to just work in their own four walls in their operations, but to really, we know this is such a complex issue. You need that pre-competitive collaboration. And I think that project very much embodies it. And we're excited to really take the follow-on to that and then replicate it for other commodities.
Awesome. Yeah, I'm maybe just going to add on to this line of thinking for just a minute here, which Alex has talked really well about how we're using this data not only, so one is public reporting, which we talked about, but two is informing the working groups and the projects that we are resourcing through the Pacific Coast Food Waste Commitment and really emphasizing our time on. The third that I'll add then is the provision of custom roadmaps back to our reporting business signatories. And this is relatively new as far as the offerings we're providing, but something we're very excited about is, data is value. When we are asking for data from businesses, that is a big ask. And so we want to be able to provide immediate feedback. And I think, Alex, one of your phrases that I love so much is decision-ready data, right? Decision-ready data back to these businesses. So we've been piloting and now providing customized individual proprietary reports back to reporting companies that show the metrics of food waste reduction, benchmarks against their peers, individualizes these impact metrics for those businesses, and then perhaps most exciting is then maps that to solutions, saying here are prioritized solutions that would affect the waste that's in your operations and supply chain. So all that to say, I love public reporting. It has so many great purposes, but I'm most excited, I think, about the ways that we're using this data beyond that and how it's really shaping the focus of the Pacific Coast Food Waste Commitment. Maybe last question for you, Alex, is just, this was a geographically bound report that was published, but this data, I think, has very obvious value, both beyond the businesses that participated, but also beyond the geography and where it happened. And so would love just to hear your thoughts on where you are seeing or could see value in this data beyond those specific reporting companies in the region itself.
Yeah, and I think that for all of you, I mean, some of the jurisdiction partners, some of the resource partners were there when we originally kicked off this project. I think that was the vision. How can this project on the West Coast really inspire broader change? And I think that we're starting to see that momentum where, you know, you look at the reductions that Jackie, you went over today. How do we replicate that across the entire country? I think we've got a very now seasoned model. We've gone through COVID, a lot of bumps along the way, but we've tested and learned, and I think we've got, you know, a pretty seasoned model to go out now and try to do this in different parts of the country with additional sectors. And so this is the vision that we had from the beginning, and I'm so grateful for the support of both the signatories and the jurisdiction partners, the other resource partners so far, to get it to this point, because it was extremely difficult and it took a lot of time, especially through COVID. So, you know, we don't have all the answers, and I think that we're looking to be able to support as many of these other efforts that are happening across the country as best we can.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Alex. Just appreciate your partnership overall, and also just coming to join me and speak for a little bit on the webinar. With that, we are having a little bit of time to take questions from the audience. So I'm going to welcome Dana back to help moderate that. I will point out there's been a lot of questions answered in the chat too. So I hope you've seen answers that have come through that are affiliated with your questions. But we will do the best we can. So Dana, I'll pass it back to you.
Awesome. I knew most of this information, and it's still really exciting to just hear it again because, like I said, it's really just, it's nice to stop, and I think we need to take a moment to like stop and celebrate for a minute. You know, we're always so full of not great news, and I think it's just really exciting to see progress. So, yeah, thank you for the celebratory emojis there. So let's start with COVID, and I don't think it's just COVID, right? Because there were a bunch of things together, right, that happened during the time that we were doing this. It was certainly COVID, and then also the supply chain disruptions that went along with that and seem to have continued for a variety of reasons, and inflation, right? The enormous amount of inflation that's been going on. So I think there's all these outside factors. How have those contributed to this reduction, if at all, versus or the really more explicit efforts that you're seeing?
Yeah, and Dana, you could probably answer half this question really, really well as well. But I think there's no doubt that COVID, inflation, supply chain disruptions had an impact, and very likely what we would call a positive impact. I hate to use the word positive associated with COVID, but a contributing impact on these numbers going down. Again, you know, as I shared earlier, there was less food in the system, as we saw from sales data. I think we all witnessed walking into stores too, how that affected it. You know, we think about how restaurants closed. We were all pushed to retail, and we are, you know, buying up that food. There was just less food to go to waste. We can't really attribute numbers to that, but I think it is easy to say it contributed to the reductions, along with things like inflation. But I want to emphasize, or the and on top of that, is that we, as Alex even indicated in his comments, have seen and are reported against really intentional efforts to reduce food waste by businesses. And this is beyond retail, by the way. This is all business signatories that we're working with. But if you know, I think Alex mentioned the technology-based solutions. We've seen a lot more work in upcycling, a lot of work in employee engagement and training and developing curriculums, establishing donation partnerships, and really actually rethinking donation coming out of COVID as well. So I think there's a lot of very tangible work we can point to that has contributed to this as well. But we can't argue that those other factors and supply chain factors definitely contributed.
One other quick example I would say to build on that is that I've seen food waste move from maybe a pet project within sustainability. You know, specifically, this is something I'm thinking about in retail, to now move into the operations side, where it's really now part of the way that they launch stores, that they work with stores. I'm not saying it's perfect. I'm not saying we're done. I'm just saying that you can see this shift. And I think that's a big part of why the progress is happening. This isn't just a side project anymore. It's something that has very clear ROI, especially if you're getting more into the prevention side. So that's just, I don't want to name names, but that's just something I see again and again across the signatories.
Yeah, totally. That's great. What about other sectors? Like, I see a bunch of food service folks on the call here, and I'm just curious, like, what are the learnings from this that might cross over to other sectors?
Yeah, I'm happy to start, and don't sit too comfortable there, other sector. I'm just kidding. No, we have started translating a lot of these data tools and products and methodologies into other sectors, specifically food service and manufacturing. Our retail partners have been champs in being going through this learning process with us. So I think we've really worked out a lot of the kinks in the overall model of how we want to get this data in. But I think there's a lot of opportunity, and obviously there are key differences in the operations of other sectors that are going to require continued learning to apply this data. But most exciting to me, I think, is that so many of the action pieces that we've talked about are actually transferable across sectors. As we start thinking about things like employee engagement, things like the role of technology, a lot of those can cross-pollinate, and there will be differences, of course, but I think we're seeing so much work in each sector that will show amazing results when we are able to share data from other sectors as well.
Yeah, I think that there's been common denominators, like you said, Jackie, employee engagement, food donation. It doesn't matter what sector you're in. There's a lot of learnings and best practices that can be shared that we've seen tremendous engagement from our food service signatories have really just taken the bull by the horns on that. It's been wonderful. So there's those more like cross-sector focuses that we have in our working groups. But then there are unique challenges to these sectors. And so that's why we've had in a parallel track just a food service kind of sector summit, or just a retail sector summit. And we're getting a lot of interest and momentum right now, I would say more in the hospitality sector. It's not there and ready to go. We've done a few case studies, but I feel like we're getting there. So it's still TBD, but I think that we're realizing it has to be that sort of 1-2 punch to make sure it's really valuable and we can drive to those truly like measurable results through some of our pilot project efforts.
Yeah. Anything else to say? You've kind of alluded to this a little bit, but just on like what the most effective strategies have been in retail settings. And then there's a kind of a follow-up question on major challenges or barriers that you think retailers still face.
Alex, I saw you nodding. Do you want to go first?
So I don't think that necessarily it's this intervention project or it's a strategy. I just think one thing that we've heard again and again from signatories that said this has been so valuable, this has been really helpful, has been being able to build specific spaces maybe for those sectors to come together where you might typically have competitors that aren't day-to-day picking up the phone, but really keeping it focused on what can we share pre-competitively, like what are some things that we're all working on together. Food waste shouldn't be something we compete on. So I can say that safely as a basis for the work that we're doing. And then obviously, having the data so that we're grounded in that first and foremost. That 1-2 motion has been what we usually are told the most. Hey, this has been really, really helpful to know. Like we had a new signatory join recently, and the first thing we did was sort of set that signatory up on sort of these speed dates, right, with other, people in the sector. And that was incredible because they were starting their strategy work, and just being able to have that sounding board, they told us was obviously very, very helpful.
And I won't repeat what Alex said, but I acknowledge that collaboration and pre-competitive work are often kind of fluffy, feel-good words, but it's been amazing to sit in rooms where it's actually happening, and we're seeing the sharing of best practices from business to business, and we're seeing the scale and replication of results. So there's we can take no credit for that, really. I mean, it's the energy with which the businesses are coming to the room and the willingness to do that. So I'm grateful for the spirit in which that's happening. And then obviously having the data to help nudge and push that into the areas that are going to have the most impact. I think the second half of that question was on the continued challenges. There are many, and they are diverse, right? I think, I come from retail in a former life, and I remember some of the challenges that we faced then are still the challenges now, which is, data is actually still hard. to get, right? So even though we have this amazing report today, like it's hard work to get it, and it's hard work to get that into translatable data. Food waste often does not have a single owner or a person who is accountable within a food business. It is often a cross-functional and cross-sector team, as it should be, but that just brings its own inherent challenges for managing that. There is no one way to solve food waste. The solutions are many, and so I think prioritizing and leaning in the right ways is also something that can provide challenges. So lots of challenges yet still to overcome, but I think part one of that is getting in the room and talking about them, which is what I'm really excited to see.
One more for me, which is just the idea of consumer perceptions. That seems to be, no matter what sector we're in, something we bump up against, where, right, you want to use more of what's being grown. You want to take some of this more like imperfect or surplus food but you're always concerned in the back of your mind is, how is that going to affect my brand perception, right? How is that going to affect the way my customers think about us? And so one of the things that I think it's a challenge, but also it's been really great to work in these safe spaces, because then we can say, look, it's not one person sticking their neck out. It's in the whole chain project, multiple people at once going after this. And so I think that, yeah, it's going to just be something that we'll have to make slow and steady progress against, so that we can try to shift people's perceptions to say, look, this is still perfectly good. This tastes great, even better in certain kinds, right? Maybe a smaller strawberry tastes better than a gigantic Frankenstein one, right? But it's going to be much more effective, and I think something more palatable for folks if you're doing it collectively.
Yeah. Yeah, and I would just add on to that. I think and sort of a solution and a challenge is just like on the ground implementation. I think something we consistently hear is just, how well are the people who are stocking the produce department and they're reviewing stuff? Are they putting stuff in the right place, right? Are the SOPs, standard operating procedures, being followed? And when they're being followed really well, that improves things than when they're not being followed really well. And I feel like that's just a consistent source of challenge, but also opportunity. So, and I think it's also, the other thing is that when you talk to these folks who are working on this, like they're doing a bunch of things at the same time. So they can't always tell you like, oh, it was this strategy that worked perfectly. They're just kind of like, oh, yeah, we've tried all these things and look, our waste is reduced, and we can't actually tell you the specific thing that made that happen. And I think that's just a reality of how complex the environment is that, this is all occurring in.
Yep.
So, okay, back to our audience questions here. This was kind of a fun one. Do the signatories ever get competitive about who can eliminate the most food waste?
Well, I will say we have had case studies that have been repeated in quick succession. I think because people have seen success and been like, oh, we can do that. Like, why can't we go try it? I think there's also like the nature of collaborative competition too, of FOMO, right? Not wanting to miss out if other peers and competitors are moving first. We have yet to have any fights or, truly combative moments of level of competition, but it truly has been an inspiring collaborative atmosphere. And I think more supportive competition to bring peers and competitors along in that. Alex, I don't know if you have other examples, but
Good
we do
answer.
see a lot of interest in
No.
not even the formal pilot. We obviously run formal pilots. We also do a lot of just best practice sharing within these working groups of, hey, what are you doing for employee donation programs, right? Or what are you doing for this? And there's a lot of, I think, just sharing and adopting of practices that they're hearing from peers.
I will say the benchmarking is extremely welcomed. When we're talking about, what's the value that people are getting back, they're always they don't want to just be asked to report something, right? And then, maybe you get data back at some point. It's not that like business ready data like Jackie was talking about. That with us it has been, and then the benchmarking has just been something, again and again, we're told, has been really valuable. So a little competition there.
Got it.
I would welcome any of our signatories who are attending to also provide examples through the chat. But
okay, this next one's going to go more towards the sort of financial end of things. So I'm going to pair two up here. One is, and there's been some questions on sort of like the price conversions and stuff that have been answered in the chat, but higher level, there's a question about how many costs have been associated with the prevention and reduction side of things. Is it mostly low cost, no cost, or do some things have significant cost? And kind of along with that, have we been able to actually quantify ROI at all?
I
Yeah,
I take that. I think the first part, like when we do, when we're thinking about what commodity, when we're thinking about, when you talk about those employee engagement projects, which of the employee ideas you're going to go after, it is the low, no costs, right? That we start with, right? It's low hanging fruit. We know it can have a high impact. So just from a prioritization standpoint, yes, we have to think about that in order for this to have a business case for our signatories to be able to get approval from, right? And, to be able to participate and get their teams across their operations to join in on. If I'm channeling Minnie, I think it's, there has been across the board a quantification. So kick me under the virtual table here, Minnie, but I think it's around 8-to-1 return, or maybe Jackie, but I believe that's the latest.
I'll add in two, maybe just other anecdotes to that. One is, I love the examples Alex gave earlier. We've run the spectrum of high tech, high cost and low tech, low cost pilots, and both are working really well, right? We had the enhanced demand planning, AI-based technology pilots that brought reduction into the stores where they were implemented. They actually paid for themselves over time as well. On the other end of the spectrum, as Alex said, we had one that involved a screwdriver, right? So like there truly are solutions at both ends of that I think there are opportunities. Cost should not be a barrier for doing something in food waste. The other thing I'll mention is I had talked about these custom roadmaps. One of the things we're very excited about in there, and these are, again, I don't take this to your financial team as like a quote, but we do try to indicate, because of the models that we have within the Insights engine, to actually try to give estimates around cost per ton, benefit per ton of different solutions. So we can actually help prioritize modeled solutions to food waste based on that ROI as well at a solutions level specifically.
All right, I'll do last one and then we'll close it up. Not to get wonkier in the end, but we haven't talked too much about the destination side of things. So, there's a question just, what have the efforts been to shape where the food is going, where the unsold food is going, like donation versus composting? And then another question about, why did anaerobic digestion go down? Do we have any sense of that? And this is maybe a clarification, but the unsold food was sent to why did the tons of unsold food sent to unknown destinations go up in 22?
Yeah. Okay, let me attempt to tackle those. They might be out of order. I'll ask our data team maybe to chime in the chat concurrently with some of the thoughts on AD perhaps. But okay, starting with one I remember, which is the unknown and unsold. So I think, again, unknown is an interesting destination that we're creating through our methodology, essentially, right? Of food that we know it's happening, we don't know where it's going. I think if anything, what that tells us is there's still just complexity in measurement. We've been doing this for 4 years. It's actually been getting easier for our signatories over 4 years. Hopefully they don't disagree with me on that, but it's still complicated, right? And there's always new systems being put in place. There are new vendors that come in for certain destinations where it can change the data sources internally within a food business of where that food is coming or that data is coming from. So my hypothesis is an increase in unknown is just that it's continuously complex to measure. And so that's going to continue to kind of go up and down as we gain visibility and then maybe lose visibility a little bit to where that food waste is happening. So it was, just remember, it was not a net increase in unsold food. That number went down. Just within that, it's a distribution of where that unsold food is going. Your first question, I think, Dana, was around destinations as well.
It was about shaping the destinations, how
Thank
are we?
you. Yeah. Alex, chime in on this too, but I think the PCFWC has really focused on prevention. That is a core focus of the PCC group as an entity and of all the partners of the PCFWC. So we really try to lean prevention heavy and actually start addressing this before we have to talk about other destinations. That being said, during COVID in particular, there was a lot of interest in food recovery, obviously, right? I think just like personally and organizationally, that was a big emphasis. And that's when we started our food recovery working group. So we have had very concentrated efforts to help improve and share best practices in food recovery. But the large majority of our pilot projects and really deep intervention projects continually to be focused on prevention.
One quick example of that, I remember being in the room a couple of years ago, we were talking about what are we going to work on together as a sector. We were talking about retail, and there was initially some interest in food recovery. And we really pushed, and a lot of the signatories immediately jumped in too, which was, let's not just start with food recovery. Let's be more ambitious and think about going upstream. What can we do to prevent and work on solutions that help to reduce the footprint of our food system as well? And again, we don't have all the solutions, but I was very appreciative of the room's openness to doing that. And that's something just because of the insights engine, right? Knowing that so much of overall food loss and waste on the West Coast happens on farms, right? We were able to kind of be opportunistic and go after a few of the commodities that were valuable to them and think about how do we do more with partners, with suppliers to tackle that issue.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. Well, I will just take a stab at this one last question, and then I think that'll be all the time we have for today. And that is around policy. There was a question asking, this happened on the West Coast, all three of the states that it's operating in. Do you have some policies related to landfill bans or restrictions or other targets around reducing food waste? So, what happens when you go to another state, and is policy important there? And my simple answer is yes, right? I think absolutely through this project, but so much of the other work we do as well, we're constantly hearing about things that are happening in California because of SB 1383 there that are not happening elsewhere. And so, organic bans in particular, very effective state policy. We have I think it's 10 states now, plus DC, that have some sort of policy on that, but that leaves 40 more to go. And we really think that those types of policies are a critical part of progress on this, because they reach everyone, right? As much as this is an amazing project of over 50% of the market share in retail on the West Coast, there's another 50%, right? And some of those are smaller. And, sometimes I think there's a long tail of businesses that are harder to reach and can use also. I will say the other thing that goes with policy is there's often a resource investment that goes along with it to making the implementation of that policy possible. And I think that's the other piece that's important. So with that, thank you all. That's all we have time for today, but really appreciate you joining and hanging in for the Q&A. Jackie and Alex, thank you guys so much, mostly for all the work you do, but also for sharing it today. And yeah, there is a report that goes along with this. So feel free to dive into more detail on that. And you can access that at the Pacific Coast Food Waste Commitment website. And you'll see who's involved, etc. So please use the contact information on your screen if you have any other questions or feedback about today's webinar, and hope that you all have a wonderful rest of your day.